Welcome, everyone. I'm Reverend Keith Kron, Director of the Transitions Office for the UUA. I currently live in Providence, Rhode Island, but I lived here in Vancouver from 2004 to 2007. As Katie Sather said to me last night on Facebook, welcome home. It is good to be back. City's not that much different. I noticed a few things, couldn't remember a few things as I was driving in last night about where to turn, but boy, did it feel familiar, and it's nice to be back on this side of the country where there is more green than there is back east. It is good to be with you all. I direct the Transitions Office for the UUA, which I've been doing now this is now my 13th year and my 27th year at the UUA. Before that, I was the Director of the Office of Bisexual, Gay, Lesbian, and Transgender Concerns. And I've been leading this workshop since 1996. This is actually the 289th time I've done the workshop in 27 years. I believe it's the 10th time in Canada that I've led the workshop. And I believe it's now the 7th time that I've done a hybrid with people online and in person. So it's all good. When you tell me something that I haven't heard before, I will let you know. Because chances are we've heard some version of some things, all of which are good. It's all good part of a process. It is really good to be with you all and to be here as you go through the search process and to be a part as the world begins to reopen and figure out what the next normal is in terms of how we lead our lives and how we make a difference in the world. This is the outline for what we're doing this morning, and we'll go through each piece. There'll be a couple of times when I'll break you all into groups, other times when it'll be me talking about things and time for question and answers with all of that. The time will go very quickly. We will take a break partway through. Let me just see if the people who are in the room, just a show of hands, search committee folks? Folks doing a whole lot of work on your congregation's behalf this year. Every time you see them, please say thank you, because they really don't know what they signed up for when they signed up for it earlier this year. Other people in leadership positions in the church. Wonderful, great to see you too. Anyone just sort of taking a year off and just being a member? This is sadly always the smallest part of the group of congregations. I often wish our congregations where people felt like they could just show up. But thank you all for being here. It is good to be with you all and be here. The Beyond Categorical Thinking Workshop came as when our ministry began to diversify. Up until the 1970s, we were pretty much all men, all heterosexual, pretty much all white, pretty much all able-bodied. And then beginning in the 70s, women, ministers who identified as people of color, indigenous, black, ministers with disabilities, gay and lesbian folks started entering into the ministry. This really picked up in the 80s. And the story that we began to hear from ministers at the UUA was that they were experiencing discrimination as part of the search process. So in 1989 at the General Assembly in New Haven, Connecticut, my third General Assembly, there passed a resolution supporting non-discrimination as part of the ministerial search process at that General Assembly. And as a result, this workshop was born, which has gone through several iterations over the years. What I will tell you, in 2022, I still hear from ministers who feel like they experience discrimination as part of the search process. It just happens in different ways than it did back in 1989 and beyond. And in 1996, when I started leading the workshop, I've noticed some significant differences. Like in 1996, we didn't cover transgender issues at all. In 1996, regardless of where you were on the continent, race was about black-white. Sexual orientation was about gay or lesbian. And gender was only about women. And disability was mainly the concern one was, is someone in a wheelchair, is someone blind, or is someone deaf? We sort of started at those extremes. As we have lived into more and more diversity, we've seen a wider range of what is covered under each of these identities, and I still hear from ministers about that, and I'll talk about that some. One of the things I'll do in the second part of the workshop is actually talk about what were the results that I often heard in 1996 from congregations. Thank you to those of you who filled out the concerns and benefit sheets. What I heard primarily last year from congregations, and what you all said. Along with, because I've done them, what differences I've heard between the States and Canada, because there are differences that I like to talk about. So we do this workshop at the request of ministers. The first year in 1989, 45 congregations were in search. 7 actually did the workshop. The other 38 all said things like, well, everyone is welcome at our church. Why would we do this workshop? For the last 3 years, it's been 100% participation of the congregations in the settled search. We have moved from a place of believing everyone is welcome to more of an idea that we all have something to learn, no matter how much work we have been doing it. And I think that's just a reality that I think that we are continuing to grow into as we move forward through this. And as we talk about a little later on, we'll see how this is a part of the search process. So we'll continue to explore that this morning, but I want to start with sort of a basic fundamental and think about identity. And what I'm going to ask the people in the room here in a moment is to get into small groups of 3 or 4 and talk to each other for a few minutes. The people who are on YouTube, what I would like for you to do is just take a couple of moments and think on your own on the questions that I'm going to pose. And then we'll come back together and see what you all came up with. But what I'd like for you to do is I would like for you to think about your life. Think about where you have lived, what schools you went to, what jobs you've had, what you were encouraged to do, what you might have been discouraged from doing. And as you think about your life and all of that, I want you to think about it under the frame of looking at it with one difference. So in your small groups of 4, for the first time, you're all going to go around. For those of you who are willing, you can pass. And think about how might your life have played out differently if you had been born a different gender than the one you have now. The second question would be, how might your life played out differently if you'd been born with a different race or ethnicity than the one you have now? The third question is, how might your life have played out differently if you've been born with a different sexual orientation than the one you have now? And then, finally, how might your life have played out differently if you've been born differently abled than the way you are now? And in your small groups, let's say there are 4 of you, you each take up to a minute or so and reflect on some of the ways your life might have been different, with the first question about gender, then about race and ethnicity, then about sexual orientation, then about disability. But take each question one at a time, take about a minute or so, and talk about that. If you have a little time at the end, you can sort of talk about what you may have thought about, particularly if someone else said something that you hadn't thought about before. And we'll come back in a little more than 15 minutes and talk about what you said. So randomly, I don't care how you divide yourself up. I used to make Unitarians count and divide off into 4 and discovered they often couldn't do it. So you find a group of 4 and find out if you're online, just take some time to think about these questions yourselves. Feel free to jot some notes, and we'll come back in a little more than 15 minutes. All right, let's regather as a large group. let's start with the first question. I'm going to ask people to share and make sure that you're speaking into a microphone. So if you have something to say you want to share, make sure you have a microphone. How might your life have played out differently if you'd been born with a different gender than the one you have now?
I'm aware that if I had been born a boy, I would have grown up in a different school setting and just culture in general. And so the concepts that I grew up with included that a girl could be a teacher, a nurse, or a secretary. And so going out of high school, of those three, the least offensive to me was to be a teacher. And so I went into university and learned how to be a teacher, even though that wasn't my calling. And it wasn't until I had experienced that, left that sort of work role and went back to university later as a mature adult to start a whole other journey in life. But it just would have been a very different life progression for sure.
It's literally the most common thing we hear from people is about what kind of job they would have had. And women in particular, particularly older women, very limited in what was possible in terms of working outside the home. Someone else?
Number 3. Yeah. So, and I said, actually, maybe it wouldn't have been much different at all that if I had been a woman. Although obviously I wouldn't have played the same sports and, if you would have had kids, but sort of went into a field that when I went in, it was sort of 50-50, and it was medicine, and it was quite acceptable. And so, maybe, I don't know, but I thought, well, might not have been that different, except that maybe would have been mother instead of a father or something like that, which is, speaking to some women in our group, that's sort of such a huge thing, actual motherhood, so.
I'm going to pick up on one thing you said, though, about the sports, because often what sports people were encouraged to play was often very different, if they were encouraged at all. And I will tell you, even today, as someone who has taught kids tennis, the serve is a basic throwing motion. The difference between boys and girls at age 5 or 6 in their ability to throw something is still significant. I was literally teaching 5- and 6-year-old girls how to throw as a way to teach them how to serve in a way that I almost never had to teach a boy. It's just sort of fascinating to watch how the subtle things play out. But in some professions, you're right. It was completely fine. I mean, you were talking about, having been a teacher. My dad was an elementary school teacher. I was an elementary school teacher. Before going in, we stood out because it was an all-female profession, but women were all glad there was a male around, sometimes because they wanted us to fix the film projector, but also just for a different role model and a different person who was there. Thank you. Someone else?
My first career was as a scenic and lighting designer, and if I had been a man, the reason I left that career was because I had 2 small children and only 6 weeks of maternity leave. So if I had been the dad in that situation, I would most likely still be in that career.
The expectation around choices is so significant. One of the things we'll talk about later that we see in ministry, every younger woman in our ministry generally is asked at some point in their career, are you going to leave us to have children? I have never had a younger man in our ministry ever asked the same question.
Born a man, I wouldn't have had the privilege of being able to stay home with my children and being affordable. And also, if I had been born a little later, I would, like now, so many women need to stay home for need to work for economic reasons. So I'm very blessed.
Right. What choices you had, very different. One of the things we'll talk about a little later is about how ministry now is often the second income in a household, and how that has affected the ministry search process. Anyone else? Yes.
I grew up on a farm, and ironically, because of my father's illness, my mother ran the farm, who taught me about being a businesswoman. She was one of the first women that went to the meetings to choose the bull semen that was going to be brought in. And so I would not have been able, and she recommended that I become a secretary. Well, I was terrible. I cheated at typing. I figured out how to do the typing tests the night before, and I would get 80 to 90 words a minute, which was not true. And I think, and then I became a sound technician, which was very unusual. So I went to school for that, but I didn't want to do that. And I wanted to be a psychotherapist, but I never told anybody because I knew that my family would laugh at that. But I really credit my mother to the success of my business because I saw what she did, the long hours she put in and the determination, and nothing was going to stop her, and she was only 5'2".
It's interesting because you remind me of my own grandparents, and they were both out of necessity. My dad's mother was a CPA, but she was the one who had to work because my grandfather was a post-traumatic stress survivor from World War I, who was alcoholic and literally was bedridden most of the day when he wasn't completely drunk. And my other grandmother in Appalachian, East Tennessee, was an elementary school teacher, and she brought home most of the income because my grandfather, who worked on a farm, had never learned to read. I mean, it's interesting how necessity often has forced people to think about things differently, and I've often wondered what would have happened, how would my life have been different if my grandfather had been asked to learn to read, and how that would have changed the dynamics in their family, or if my other grandfather hadn't been in World War I and seen basically 200 people die on a sinking ship, if that family life would have been different. I mean, little things like that, just so fascinating. Thank you. Someone else.
Thanks. I grew up with as I was telling my little group here, a military father, and who had gone through 2 wars. And who knows what happened to him. I left home when I was 12. I couldn't stand them. And I was on my own from, I guess it was somewhere between 12 and 13 in that area. And had I been born differently, I don't know. I was definitely on my own from that time, with help from others. I mean, you don't just run away and create your own world and stuff, although I was good at that. And I think being born differently, well, if I'd been born a woman or a female, I wouldn't be suffering from male pattern baldness. There's other things that were advantageous, I think, too. So, but I think that's about it. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else before we move on to race or ethnicity? Yes.
Yeah, this is a little different. I'm sitting here thinking about this. And we have had several, at least a couple I know of, concerted investigations on how to make our stage wheelchair accessible.
We'll get to disability in a minute, yeah.
Oh, okay.
We'll do all of them, but save that. Please come back to that. Let's move on to race and ethnicity. How might your life have played out differently if you'd been born a different race or ethnicity than the one you have now?
For my life, it would have been completely different because I grew up in New York, New Jersey, and spent my summers as a youth in the South where Jim Crow still existed and KKK was out at night and racism was full on, and you just were, if you were black, it was just a whole different world.
Completely different existence. Someone else.
I grew up in Red Deer, Alberta, and it's a small town in the middle of Alberta and quite, I'm going to say, backwater at that time. And also, I think Alberta is 20 years behind the rest of the world. So I didn't know any people of different color early on, and then we did take in a lot of refugees, I think from Vietnam and other places, and so seeing how they got treated, it would have been such a different life for me. I'm had a very privileged, sheltered existence.
Thank you.
I was saying to our group that I grew up in Chilliwack in the 70s and 80s, and I know if I had been born on reserve, our subdivision backed onto a reserve, I would have been one of the last generations to go to residential school. So I think there's absolutely no question my life would be completely different. I know there's always exceptions to these stories and that there's folks out there, Indigenous folks, that are doing well. Statistically speaking, though, some of the people I went to elementary school and high school with are dead or living in poverty or addiction. So I just think there's absolutely no question that my life and my opportunities would be completely different, starting with elementary school and being taken away from my family. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
So I also grew up in a valley that was all white. The only sort of anyone who was of different color was the Chinese restaurant. And now that I've read stories about how isolating and lonely it was, and I never thought about the children. But I also was reflecting that my brother went to university in Edmonton, and at U of A, they were bringing in a lot of people from all over the world into engineering. And this goes back to my mother again. He would ask her, could he bring somebody home? And I remember being probably 6 or 7, and that was the first time I met somebody who was East Indian. And my mother was curious, and so she just asked all these questions like, what can you eat? What can't you eat? And I have to say, I'm really grateful for her generosity, because we live in a small house that used to be a Jehovah's Witness house that got transformed into a house. But I'm very grateful for that generosity that my mother had, that my brother would bring these people home. And I'm also very grateful that my brother did that. And at that point, I never thought, like, I think probably what it taught me was the possibility that I could go to school. If somebody could come from India and go to school, why couldn't I possibly go to school? So.
And your mother asked questions too, right? What's interesting about that to me, I mean, there's everything you said was interesting, but one of the things that's interesting about that to me is that so often what parents want to do with their kids is put them in diverse settings and hope that that's enough. And yet the reality is what really matters is, are the parents engaged? Because the children are watching the parents and their engagement for cues about how to interact with the world. So the parents that have just simply tried to put their children in a diverse daycare or in a diverse school end up actually having significant differences with their kids, because their kids are like, well, sure, I can talk to my friends, but you don't. So it actually creates friction. So your mother's willingness to engage there, huge difference, and and I hear that as you talk about her.
Is this on? Yep. Yeah. We had next door neighbors, and they were Japanese Canadian. And I was over there one morning for breakfast, and because the little boy was my friend, and they invited me for breakfast after. I haven't had breakfast yet. Come on in. I'll be right with you. And I looked at this box on their breakfast table, and I said, "You guys eat Rice Krispies?" It was such a shake to my mind. I thought, well, they're so different, that. Anyway, they still are friends.
So I don't think I was impacted a lot directly by my ethnicity as growing up as a Jew in Montreal, but clearly my father and his brother were. They both went to McGill, and McGill has a long history of anti-Semitism that stretched up to about 2 years before I started there in 1964. But 2 years before I started, McGill had, if you were Jewish and you wanted to get into McGill, you had to have a higher mark. Previously, they had quotas in terms of absolute numbers. My father, if he had felt that he could choose whatever he wanted and go into whatever work he wanted, he probably would not have gone into accountancy, which is what he ended up doing, because he figured at least he could find a job there. And when he filled out job applications, and in those days religion was one of the questions asked on a job application, he learned very quickly that as soon as he saw the line for religion, he could throw out the application form, because as soon as he put down Jewish, he wasn't going to get a job. Because he couldn't get a job as a Jew, he started his own practice as an accountant because he had no choice, so that's what he did. His brother went to law school at McGill, finished first in the class in law school, but the law school would not give him the award which they gave out to the person who ranked first. They wouldn't give it to my uncle because a Jew had won it the year before. So anyhow, and then his next experience with anti-Semitism at McGill was he was working there as an instructor. He went into Paris and got a PhD in law. And he was working there like as a sabbatical replacement or something, and at the end of the year there was a position available and he applied for it, but he wasn't considered, and again it was because he was Jewish and they wouldn't hire him. And so he left and he went to Louisiana, because Louisiana has the same French civil code as Quebec does, and so he was qualified for it, as it were. And he made a great career as a professor at Louisiana. But those are two clear examples in my own life, not me directly, but one generation removed, where the ethnicity of being Jewish had a huge impact on the paths that they took. So.
Thank you. I saw another hand, I think over here. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I've also been really aware that I grew up in a time period, if I had been born Indigenous, I would have definitely been sent to a residential school. And it wasn't until I was about 19 or 20 that I first started meeting Indigenous friends through school. And when I first started teaching as an elementary school teacher on Vancouver Island in Port Alberni, I had children in my class, this is grade 2, 3, 4 age, who were staying in a residence in Port Alberni area, and the children were as far away as from Kispiox, northern BC, Ahousaht, west coast of Vancouver Island. And so that was my first experience being with children who were Indigenous and were away from home, didn't have that home support. And I watched them support each other, as particularly the little 6-year-old, 7-year-old who was from Kispiox, who would just have, go crying and so forth, just so homesick. So it really opened my eyes to the reality and also and the strength of these kids to support each other, and really loving kids. They really impressed me.
You remind me of two things, and we'll go on to sexual orientation here in a second. One of which was when I was in elementary school in Kentucky in the States, I lived through desegregation. The desegregation was all one way. Only the black students were bused. None of the white students were bused. So you had people with incredibly long bus rides, incredibly long commutes, going to a school that wasn't in their neighborhood, while the white kids all stayed in their neighborhood. What was fascinating in one of my teaching positions, because the city of Lexington was growing so fast in the late 80s, I had students bust into our school from two areas. There were the black students who were bussed in, and then there were white students from a new suburb where they hadn't built a school yet. And what fascinated me is that the white students who were bused were worse behaved because they were not used to it, as opposed to the black students for whom this had been a generational norm and their parents had lived through it. And you just watch different behavioral differences that happened. And it was just so fascinating to see all of that and how one-directional so often the education generally has been, where all of the burden has been on the students of color, the indigenous students, to do that, to provide the support and do all of that, and in some ways create stronger community than for the white folks. So thank you for that. Let's move on to sexual orientation. How might your life have played out differently if you've been born with a different sexual orientation? Oh, the other thing I wanted to say, only in Canada do I get examples that are not black-white when the white people think about race. It doesn't matter where you are in the United States. It doesn't matter if you're in Seattle or San Francisco or a place that's predominantly Asian or Hispanic. It's still a black-white issue. That's clearly one of the divides that happens depending on where you are. That's not to say racism doesn't exist. It's just, it's interesting what people's norms are.
Is there not a Hispanic divide as well?
I'm sorry? I need the mic.
Not an Hispanic divide as well?
I have done the workshop in places that are predominantly Hispanic. What the white people talk about are race as a black and white issue. I mean, this gives you some sense of the United States and the differences. Fascinating. We have congregations who want to do anti-racism work, who want to work with a black church in their community, despite, for example, being in a Vietnamese neighborhood or a Latina neighborhood, where literally they know no one in their neighborhood. This is a whole adult ed class, but let's move on to sexual orientation.
So I've worked in careers that, well, theater and as a religious educator, which have been very open to various sexual orientations. But being bisexual, I think if I had been on either full end, lesbian or heterosexual, it would have been a different experience through my life.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Because often it's forgotten. And in some way, again, people go to the extreme, one or the other. Thank you. Someone else? Anyone else? Yes.
Well, sometimes I wonder, I am a heterosexual, cisgendered woman, but sometimes I wonder if I had choices when I was younger, if I would be so heterosexual. I have no idea, but it wasn't a choice.
It's a great question, and so often people feel like it's a very binary choice. They only have one choice. There was a study done in the early 70s, familiar with the Kinsey scale, 0 to 6. 0 being completely heterosexual, 6 being completely homosexual. They did a study in sexually repressed cultures, like most of North America, and non-sexually repressed cultures, which are basically any number of indigenous communities around the world, Aboriginal people of Australia, the Dagara people of West Africa, some of the indigenous tribes here in North America. And they did interviews of folks and, did one-on-one interviews, and they asked people to say, where do you fit on the scale? In sexually repressed cultures, 10% identified as a 0, 10% identified as a 6, and most everyone identified as a 1. That was the largest, with smaller along the way. In non-sexually repressed cultures, 1% identified as a 0, 1% identified as a 6, and most people identified somewhere between 2 and 3. I think one of the things that we're seeing in the sort of explosion in the conversation around sexual orientation and gender identity, it's like we are no longer necessarily locked in to the narrow walls we had been locked into even 20 and 30 years ago. I mean, I have a friend who was a teacher who, because he grew up Catholic in a very strict Catholic home, didn't even have the words for what it was until he finally found something in his 50s. I mean, he just assumed he got married, had 2 kids, and then all of a sudden, it kind of dawned on him after being exposed to something, actually my feelings are towards someone of the same gender. But because he'd grown in such a strict household, not a clue. Didn't even know that was an option. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I mean, you think about what Unitarian Universalism has done about your sexuality in our whole lives and the conversations that it's allowed to happen and expanding it across the ages. It's going to be interesting to see what evolves, because 20 years from now it'll look different than it is now. Anyone else on sexual orientation? A couple more people.
I realize now I wouldn't have my kids because if I had been straight, I would have been in a straight relationship with somebody with sperm, probably. So that would have been different. And so instead, I have these kids who are genetically related to their 2 older siblings and come from an egg donor and a random sperm donor. So I'm only a parent because I'm queer. So I don't think. Yeah, I can't imagine it. I wouldn't have this kid. That's weird. That's really weird.
Right. Different choices about parenting. I mean, I often hear from some folks they either wouldn't have had kids or they think about it differently. How they would have had kids would have been differently. I mean, you know, and the decision about having kids, it was an actual decision. For some people, it actually isn't. They do it without thinking, and it just sort of happens. There was another hand.
I would just say that I'm bisexual and have had relationships with men and with women over time. And one of the things, and I come from a Catholic family, eldest brother is a priest, not surprisingly. And so one of the things that I have journeyed with is the journey with a Catholic priest in the family who has, I mean, the scene when introducing my new female partner to my brother, the priest, in a family setting. And it's a journey where he has tried his best to be warm and welcoming. And so it's been a journey over time with somebody whose religion believes that, you know, it's wrong, it's sinful not to be heterosexual. And to find somebody trying their best to love the person, love the sin, hate the sin, but love the sinner, you know, but just to be warm and welcoming as possible in that. And I have learned a lot in that process of just, you know, being with somebody who's trying hard to be as good a person as they can in a thought process, a way of being in the world that is so different.
Yep. And the range of what it means to be Catholic politically is so wide. And it's so interesting that the UUs who are former Catholics actually have a stronger sense of justice than I think a lot of the UUs do, because they grew up with a sense of justice around economic issues that they were very aware of and are often and very good about that, but so, what's the word I want? So not encouraged to have open conversations about sexuality and sexual orientation at all. And, you know, and you just sort of see the difference. Anyone else before we go on? Thank you. Let's move on to ability. How might your life have played out differently if you'd been born differently abled than the way you are now?
In our group, it sort of was one of the things that would have made the biggest difference. Because, like, if you're in a wheelchair, you know, if you sort of born with sort of significant mental, physical disability, that just so completely changes your life. And everybody in the group said, that's huge.
Just simply basic choices would have been completely different. Thank you. Yes, one and then two.
Yeah, I've been, can you hear me? Yeah, a naturalist and love being outdoors, and in that, out of that, I got into the environmental business, you know, consulting and doing studies, and that involved a lot of field work, which I would not have been able to do if I had been in a wheelchair or I couldn't see, for example. And so I wouldn't have been able to follow the career that I loved. You know, I would have had to do something else probably. Maybe in the same field, but it wouldn't have got me out in the woods.
Right. Career choices often very different. You had your hand up too.
I worked as a homemaker in order to make it through university. So I was the student who had smells of vinegar and things on my hands as I rode up to university. But you know, the people that I took care of were disabled in many ways, and what they taught me was the full-on life they had despite it. So on one hand, I mean, I don't know if my parents could have had a farm, you know, had one of us been disabled. On the other hand, I'll tell this little story. I remember I worked for a woman who was blind, who was having an affair with another man who was blind because his sighted wife couldn't stand him being blind. And Alan redid rattan chairs, in Victoria. So he fixed these chairs which is very skilled. And he built a machine, blind, that he could use. And I remember one day having to go downstairs to do the laundry, and I said to Alan, the CBC was playing full on, there was some rock music going on, Alan's machine was going, he was working, and I yelled down to Alan, "Where's the light?" And he said, "Right, I forgot you're handicapped." So these were two people who were living a full-on life and developed a sense of humor also about, Alan would say, "Ella, I think we're not having chicken soup, I think we're having pear soup today." So they taught me a lot about living on, so it was about their ability to rethink, because some of them had become in the state that they were maybe 10 or 20 years before. But it was a very rich life they had too, depending on who they were in terms of their character.
Sure. It's interesting. What are the skills that you sort of have to enhance in some way because of your identity in the world? I mean, here's a person who may have learned probably a natural sense of humor, but by using it, it made things easier in terms of getting along. You think about what are the things that women have to do when they're in a primarily male setting. All the different things that we sort of use to sort of adapt into the wider world. One and then two.
Yeah, I have a very good friend who's in a wheelchair. And of course, people assume probably she's not very bright. She said, kind of people talk down to her. She's very bright, able to hold a good job if she's able to be hired. But one of the most hurtful things she finds, she has 2 sons. And when people find that out, how did you get, how did that happen? They just don't understand that she's still able to do a lot of things, able to have intercourse, able to have a husband, and actually able to bear children. And I had another friend that I went through high school with who was blind, and he was one of the first people to go through the regular high school system in BC, I think. And he had developed some amazing abilities, because we'd be driving somewhere and we'd be lost. And he said, "Oh, we just passed Knight Street." "Well, Jerry, how did you know that?" He said, "Well, you know, there was Granville, there's Oak, well," he said, "I just listened to the traffic." And he knew where we were a lot better than we did, but we didn't give him credit for that for later on. And just the assumption that if he's blind, he doesn't know where he is. When he first came to our house, he said, could you take me through the house? And I thought, here's the living room, kitchen, bathroom. And we'd be over on a Saturday evening, he'd have to go to the bathroom. I'll take that. No, I know where it is. And he had maybe a photographic memory of some sort and was able to do a lot of things that we couldn't do. And eventually we gave him credit for that, but it took a while.
The adaptive skills are really kind of amazing. And the first part of your story, really so much about how quickly someone gets reduced to a single story. It's like people forget that someone who has some sort of disability might actually also have a sexual orientation of some way, because all they see is the disability.
I have what they call vertigo, which showed up here a couple of years ago in a minor form. And a couple of days ago, I was out walking, and I kind of misstepped and just pushed against a wall to retain balance. And it was at that point, it was like this little wave of gratefulness came over that said, at least I don't have, and then I think it was, at least I can walk. I'm not in a wheelchair. But one of the things that the handicaps that in my last real work schedule as a therapist was working with addicts. And that's pervasive. Given the number of people here today, there's probably one or two that are suffering from that. And I think that's one of the handicaps, one of those invisible handicaps, not just mental wellness, but also an addiction that so many people are fighting these days.
Yeah, invisible disabilities. We'll talk about that in a bit, but thank you for raising that.
John Boyle raised the question of getting up onto the stage here, and one of my joys of my existence here at UCV was that I was a lay chaplain for 6 years, and I don't think I could have done that because I couldn't get up on the stage.
Just simply access to different places, and you know, at certain times, just imagine what it would have been like trying to find access 50 years ago. Some people just literally didn't go out of the house because there were no places for them to go.
For me, it's imagining what would it be like not to have a physical disability, because I had polio at age 5. So, you know, I lived through all of the elementary school feelings of being ostracized from certain things. But my parents were key in encouraging me to do everything that I could do. And sometimes that led me to do things that I really shouldn't have done because it just didn't make any sense. But there still was that spirit of it. And the thing that came up in our group, which I think is really applicable here, is, you know, I can imagine my inside, I'm a real athlete and can do many things that I actually can't do. But then what my brain tells me is that, and this came up in our group, I wouldn't be the person that I am if I hadn't had that experience. So there's that part of it to look at it as well.
Thank you.
On a similar note, I had a very visible disability as I was a child, in that I had, legally blind, in the sense that I'm blind in one eye and the other one just sees the big E. Now I have a contact lens, so it's not visible, but when I was in school, I wore giant glasses that were very obvious. So the very first day I arrived at school, I was bullied constantly. I was the one that was called all kinds of horrible names. So when my firstborn daughter inherited my condition, I was pretty devastated. You know, I thought, oh my God, she's going to suffer the way I did. But the interesting thing you brought up was that, and there's a lot of shame involved. To this day, you know, I adapt in different ways. Like I took a picture of with my camera that I now have, my phone, that I could blow up. But in the past, I would have had to just go without knowing it. And to this day, I can't see anything that's on screens, and I almost never put up my hand. When my daughter was in school, she had these strong glasses, but she wouldn't wear them. She had a machine in the classroom that would blow up. She would never use it. So there's a lot of shame with disabilities. But the interesting thing that I heard you mention was that my daughter is gay. I was oblivious because I had no exposure to people that were gay at that time. And she only came out when she was 18 years old. So she was pretty isolated in school. She found her path in woodwork, and she spent a lot of time doing woodwork. But she didn't come out to me until she was 18, and I wonder how much more that isolated her. She finally found her community after she left home, you know, in the gay community, but now it's expanded into a larger community. So I guess I wanted to bring up the shame piece that people, they try and act like they're normal. And that's unfortunate.
What people have to do to fit in, what people have to do to feel safe in particular places. I mean, the ostracization in school, if you were perceived as the only one. I mean, both of you talked about that in terms of both polio and the glasses. But, I mean, if you were the only black kid or Asian kid in a particular school, if you were in... one of my stories that I always tell at some point, there are a couple of stories that I tell, one of which, when I was teaching elementary school, I loved this science curriculum because it was all hands-on. And the teachers all hated it because it didn't involve a book, it involved actually doing experiments all the time, which I thought was terrific. Because the teachers hated it, they created a teaching video about how to teach this science curriculum, which they showed for years. And I actually was a part of teaching the teachers how to do it. And finally, like the third year that I was teaching the class, after seeing the video, this woman raised a hand and said, does it make a difference that the teacher didn't call on a girl or a student of color until the 9th time they called on someone? They had been using this video for 5 years, and no one had noticed or no one had felt like they could say anything about it. It led them to remake the video, but you talk about the little ways in which things happen. You reminded me of that. My mother was a special education teacher. She taught in rural Connecticut. She had 18 students in her class. This was in the 1960s. No two students had the same disability. They ranged in age from 6 to 20. She was the only adult in the classroom. That's what special education was like for her. That was the kind of education. Yet when I was teaching it, you both made me think about this. Students with visible disabilities were sometimes brought into the classroom for a part of the day, maybe for one subject. If the student had an invisible disability, something like attention deficit, some sort of dyslexia, whatever it was, parents were actively campaigning to not have their children labeled as having this because of the stigma and shame involved. Today, you see parents actively campaigning to get their students diagnosed so they have access to the kind of equal education opportunities that are there. And we're seeing this evolution, and what's interesting on so many levels is that in some ways there's a whole lot of evolution going on in some places and not so much in others. We'll talk about that in terms of things like stigma, because often when you say disability, most people only go to visible disabilities that they see, and we know more and more folks with invisible disabilities that they have to deal with, and the way that you're treated. And if you think about the world, let's just think about the world for a moment. Identity is always there. It goes from the moment you're born. What's the first question that every new parent is asked? Is it a boy or a girl? Immediately the identification begins to happen. And then there are expectations that are already built in so often around that. Now what's interesting is what happens when we see someone and we don't neatly identify them as male or female. Because I've worked with any number of transgender folks over the years. And in Boston, it's interesting, walking down the street with someone who identifies as trans or gender non-binary. Now, Boston is about as liberal as it gets in the United States, definitely top 2 or 3, and every single person we would walk by would turn their head. This is like, what gender is this person? Now, what was even more interesting about that, we would walk down the streets and I would literally watch about once a week someone get mad. You'd see their face contort because they felt like they had a right to figure out a person's gender. And several times a year, I'd watch someone do something like pound their fist into their hand, threatening physical violence. In theory, we're getting better about that, but when you talk with trans and gender non-binary people, this is something they live with all the time, and it affects how they feel safe, how they use their time. And all of that matters. Now, what's interesting, we also do this around race and ethnicity. The difference is if we can't figure it out, we make it up. We just assume based on what we perceive someone to be. Friend who was from India, massage therapist, constantly told after he came here that he needed to go back to the Middle East, and that really spiked after 9/11 happened. They just assumed. Worked with a woman who identified as Latina when I was a chaplain at San Francisco General Hospital. Very dark-skinned woman from Panama. She would say, I identify as Latina and not black. And even people she would tell that to would identify her to her face as being black, because they immediately went to that particular understanding of who we are. Sexual orientation, in general, we've assumed sexual orientation, unless someone fits a particular stereotype, and then we assume another sexual orientation. And it's fascinating how that sort of affects the world. And it's interesting, as we were talking about earlier, how that becomes a single story. A friend of mine in the States, minister, both African American and gay, has been told by people, you are so gay, I forget you're black. No idea what to do with that, but it's interesting how quickly he gets reduced to a single story. If you live with a disability, if it is seen, more often than not, the first thing that is experienced is pity. People pity you. They feel sorry for you. They are grateful it's not their lives. If you have an invisible disability, something that's not seen, all the folks who have this disability will tell you, whatever the invisible disability is, they have been told multiple times, if not every day in their life, you just have to work harder. My godson, who has a learning disability, about organization, told every day of his school career, you just have to work harder at being organized. His parents had him tested. This is what the test shows. He said he's not going to organize in the way that most schools want him to organize things. So the psychologist and his parents would go and talk to every teacher and say, he's going to need help organizing. If you want him to organize in this way, he'd simply hear every day, you have to work harder at being organized. All the little things that people has experienced. And the thing is, we see it in ministerial search. We still see it in ministerial search. And you'd like to think, oh, we don't have to worry about this as an issue. Just a couple of years ago, search committee members, there are going to be moments in this next few minutes where perk up your ears and sort of take mental notes. First mental note to take, ministers in search talk to each other, even when they're applying for the same congregation. Two ministers, equal amount of experience, one man, one woman, in talking to each other, had learned the initial salary they were going to make to each of them, there was a $10,000 difference, more for the man than for the woman. And they offered it to the woman first, they believe, so they wouldn't have to pay as much. Still in Unitarian Universalism, just a couple of years ago. Here's what every minister of color in our movement tells me they experience when they go into a congregation. Regardless of country or geographic area, a third of the congregation is thrilled. We have a minister of color. Now we can really get to work on issues of race and racism. And the minister is going to lead us. A third of the congregation is patting themselves on the back. Look, see, we're not racist. We've called a minister of color. We have Exhibit A in our pulpit. every Sunday morning. A third of the congregation is petrified because they think all the minister is going to talk about are issues of race and racism. So what we've learned is that our ministers of color are less likely to talk about issues of race or racism for fear of being seen as a single issue minister. Because even if they say this is the reality, a third, and a third, this group will say, sure, see, that proves they're only a single issue minister. This group will be disappointed in them for saying, yes, we still have racism to work on. Less likely to talk about it. We've done so much work on sexual orientation. This is a place where it is clear we have done so much work, and yet it still happens. Congregation in search, another place search committee members take notes, had a good interview, initial Zoom interview with the congregation. The congregation was checking references. References talk to the applicants. And what the references all told the applicant, gay man in search, they said the first question they asked was, does the minister preach anything other than gay sermons? Minister reached out to me, we talked. I said, how did you feel about this congregation? He said, until this happened, they were my number one choice. This has given me some pause. So I suggested to the minister, if they invite you to come to do the pre-candidating week, you need to talk about this. This cannot be something you never talk about. They did. They said, it's not an issue, but we have a couple of members who are worried about that are going to see that this might be a single issue thing, and we want to be ready to head them off at the pass. So he was willing to live with that. But after the weekend, he thought things were fine. The second round of references all reached out to him and said, the first question they asked me is, does this minister have any social justice issues they're interested in that aren't about gay and lesbian issues? At which point the minister withdrew from the process. The next day, the chair of the search committee reaches out to me and he goes, can we talk about, we had just had a minister withdraw, and I was quietly thinking, yes, I know, and I know why, about all of this. So she called me up, and we talked about this for a moment. She said, we still aren't quite sure why he left. I said, well, let me ask you a question about your other two ministers that you looked at. Did you ever ask them if they preached about anything other than straight sermons? Did you ask them if they had, did you ask the references if they had any social justice issues they were interested in that were other than just about straight people? You've created a double standard here for this person that you don't have for the other two folks. He was rightly worried that this was going to be something he was going to face throughout his entire ministry with you and didn't want to deal with it. It would have been perfectly okay for you to ask all your candidates what are their social justice interests they're interested in, what are the themes that you return to in your preaching. But as soon as the questions all of a sudden shift about a particular piece of the identity, all of a sudden that creates red flags for folks. Another congregation, I mean, these things still kind of get to me, because I'm surprised that in 2022 we're still dealing with this. Congregation, your search committee will get to a point when they will send our office, after they've looked at all the folks, these are the people who we would say yes to. And they give them to me in order, and we make sure that, try and make sure there's an equitable process about this. The first yes of this congregation, gay man, decided to go elsewhere. The second yes, also a gay man, decided to take the church. Failed vote on the part of the congregation when the search committee happened. Here are the difference between the two people. Because the search committee said, well, we thought they were similar to each other in what they brought. Extrovert, introvert. Humanist, Christian. Liked telling stories, didn't like telling stories. Loved the work of congregational life, loved social justice, really interested in just preaching a good sermon, period. And yet somehow the search committee had decided in large part because of their identity, that these two folks were going to be alike. It's like that happened just a couple years ago. Fascinating how some of these things work. Our ministers with disability, far less likely to be open about their disability. The most closeted group of ministers that we have, terrified that they won't get a job. With the ministers who've been willing to talk about it, I've said you have to answer two questions. One, talk about the stamina that you have to be able to do this job and that you can do all parts of this job. Because I can tell you, 289 times that I've done this workshop, the number one concern every single time is that a minister with a disability will not be able to do the job. The only 2 times it hasn't happened is when the congregation has had a minister with a disability who had led by example. The other question you have to answer is, talk about how you take care of yourself so the congregation doesn't have to, that you are self-sufficient. The group of ministers willing to do that, whether their disability is visible or invisible, have had an equal percentage of finding a congregation of those who people just assume don't have a disability. Hugely important. Every year, we're going to get to case studies after the break. Every year we add case studies of things that have actually happened in the search process, where people have experienced some sort of discrimination. Minister who is neurodiverse, and for them, because it's not always the same, had said, what that means is I don't look directly at people. I will listen, I'll be present, but I won't be with them. They were told by a search committee they would have gotten the job if they'd looked directly at them, even after the minister had said, this is the condition I live with. This is why people still remain closeted about they're afraid that these things are going to happen. And the minister felt like they had to be upfront about this, because it's like they're going to notice, so if I tell them, it'll improve the odds. It didn't help. And again, what we hear so often is not our congregation doesn't want you. We hear more things like, ministers hear things like, you were great, you were our second choice, as a way to make it easier and better as a part of the search process. Let me talk a little bit about the state of Unitarian Universalism and the ministerial search, and then we'll get ready for a break.
Yeah, we've tried several times studies and to make our stage wheelchair accessible, and we haven't managed to do it. I think the heart is still there, but we haven't done it. And so I'm just alerting us, I guess, in our committee that watch out for unintentional bias against people who are in a wheelchair, because we shouldn't do that, of course, and perhaps somehow buildings and grounds or the board needs to actually get serious about making our stage wheelchair accessible.
Well, this next section may help. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why as I go through. State of Unitarian Universalism. This year, at the moment, we have 35 congregations in the settled search. That's 10 more than last year, but it's about 5 less than what is typically normal. Normally, we have about 40 congregations in the settled search process. You were one of 2 Canadian congregations in the settled search process this year, the other being Calgary, looking for a minister. They're a little bit smaller, and we're talking about completely different geographies. And let me talk about that for a moment. We'd like to say that the identity doesn't matter about a person, and yet there are other identities that do matter that we don't talk about. Interestingly enough, how many of you are the oldest child in your family? Youngest child? Middle child? Only child? Birth order is a better predictor of behavior than gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or ability. Yet rarely does someone hear, you did that because you were an only child. You did that because you were an oldest child. But often people hear, you did that because you were whatever their identity was. We talked about some of the subtle biases and the adjustments people make. Anyone else left-handed? There are three of us in the room. We're constantly making adjustments in the world. Driving cars, in the kitchen. Chainsaw company in the United States that says don't sell our product to left-handed people. They're more likely to lose a limb. I mean, we get very good at adaptation. But the reality is when it's designed for something, you're doing a lot of translating in your mind. One of the ones that really matters, culture and geography. This is what made me think about it. Does the minister like and understand the culture of the place they are moving to and living to if they aren't from that particular area? Because people make assumptions that the world operates the same. We still have ministers, a place where the search committee can be careful, who still think of Canada as the 51st state in the United States. So not true. Having lived here, people who might think Canada is monolithic because they've been to New Brunswick, they think British Columbia is going to be like that. Or let's suppose they've been to Kamloops or Kelowna, they're going to assume Vancouver is like if they haven't been here before because, again, they've reduced it to a single story. One of the things that's really important for the search committee to do is to talk about the culture of Vancouver. What is specific here? In fact, the culture of Vancouver is closer to Seattle and Portland than it is to like a Montreal or a Toronto, and someone who's only been to Montreal or Toronto might not know that. And that becomes really important in the search process because someone's going to figure out, is this a place where I can be for a while? Every year I talk to one or two ministers who've said, I just don't like the area. Or what may become true, the area is too expensive for me to live. I didn't realize how much it cost to live in a particular area. That really is going to be an increasing factor as far as the ministerial search process. That I think is really true. But getting back to the state of UU ministers. Number of ministers, last year we had 59. To give you some reference points, when I started in the position in 2010, there were 130 ministers. It has gone downhill every year in terms of numbers. More and more ministers retiring, leaving ministry to do something else. That has doubled and tripled during the great resignation that has happened in the last couple of years with the pandemic. And fewer people going into ministry wanting to do congregational ministry because they tend to be younger and they want to go into places where they feel like they can make a difference and they're not sure that a congregational ministry is the place where they feel like they can make a difference. Can't predict what numbers are going to happen this year. Two signs that have given me a little bit more hope. Last year, we only had 5 people new to ministry want to go into congregational settings. Already know of 7. And there's another meeting where people will be credentialed in December. So slightly higher numbers, slightly higher interest. Last year, beginning of October, and this year at the beginning of October. This year at the beginning of October, I've talked to like 12 ministers who are interested in going into search for the next year. And now it's up about 20. Last year on October 1st, I had talked to 0 ministers interested in moving. So that gives me some hope that there is going to be more people looking. I've already talked to at least 4 ministers who are at least going to look at your record sheet when it comes live for them to look, one of whom is highly likely to apply. We'll see. But last year there were some congregations that had no one. Granted, they tended to be 100-member congregations. But the leading change in the search process has now been, can I afford to live there? Because ministry is now a 2-income profession for most families. Can the spouse get a job? Can we find a place to live? It was very interesting working with the folks on the North Shore a few years ago when they were in search, because it was like they were all recommending Burnaby. Because they didn't think someone could afford to live in West Van or North Van, particularly someone right out of seminary. It's going to be interesting for people to sort of figure out what might be possible. And then the question is, where do they want to live? Do they want to live in Vancouver? Would they rather live? I mean, I had dinner with two friends from when I lived here last night, and we were talking about that. It's like, when are you going to move back here? It's like, well, maybe if and when the UUA lets me, and after my mother dies. But I was like, I would probably live in Steveston. I like the quietness of Steveston, and would rather commute in. So all of these things come into play. They all really do matter. Question, and then I want to move on and give you a break. Microphone.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm not sure I quite understood what you said at the beginning. What I gathered is that you said that this year there are 35 congregations looking for a minister. Last year there were 59 ministers who were candidates.
59 people who applied for the 25 congregations in search.
35.
35 this year, 25 last year.
Okay. Okay, so more ministers applying for than there are positions available.
That's always true. You want a 2-to-1 ratio at least. Let me talk about that for a minute.
Okay, so I got the numbers approximately right.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. I always look at the ratio of ministers to congregations. The reason is new ministers will apply almost anywhere. They tend to not, unless they have a spouse who's got a great job, they're likely to be. Minister with experience, very focused in their search. They may apply for only one congregation or two. They may want to be, the most common story here, I want to be within 3 or 4 hours of family. I want to be in a place where my spouse can get a job. So that all affects. I mean, in the States, the worst place to be looking for a minister is Michigan, because no one goes through Michigan. So no one has any sort of connection to it. So where you are actually does matter. Vancouver to San Diego, Maine to Northern Virginia, Minneapolis, Chicago, Austin, Texas, and Denver have all historically been popular over the years. All that information is pre-pandemic. I'm not predicting anymore. I mean, because who knows? I think we're in a very liminal moment, and it's going to continue to change. But I always look at the ratio of ministers to congregations. If it's more than 2-to-1, it's generally a pretty good year for congregations. If it's less than 2-to-1, it's a horrible year for congregations, because there just aren't enough people applying in different places, and some of the smaller congregations really get hurt. Like, for example, I'm less worried about you and more worried about Calgary in terms of the search, because how many people have actually been to Calgary? Or they think, as someone didn't quite say but almost did, it's the U.S.'s version of Texas, which it does have that reputation. I mean, it's like politics.
Hi, we were earlier talking about labeling and prejudices. What should we think about in terms of looking at a new minister straight out of school as opposed to a very, very experienced person?
Before the pandemic, it was about 2/3 minister with experience, about 1/3 of the people who were new. Last year was such an anomaly. I've never seen statistics like last year, for example, because we only had 5 people who were brand new to ministry, and all of them were geographically isolated. It was almost like they weren't in the search process. I think only one of them got a job because of, we'll see what this year brings. You want to look what kind of life experience they've had. You want to see where they've done their internship, if they've done something in a similar setting. What congregation did they come out of? Because it might be they've been in a congregation that has some similarities that are a part of it. With all of them, but even more so, you want to check the references to see if this is something you think they're up for. Let me go through the rest of my stats and then get to questions, and we'll take a break, because I want to give you some identity stats. Up until last year, for my entire time in this office, 60% of the people in search have been women, regardless of the side of the pool. What has changed is the number of men and the number of trans and gender non-binary folks. Usually it's been, when I started, it was like 39% men. Now it's about 35%, with 5% of the folks now identifying as trans or gender non-binary. And that number is only going to grow, particularly if they're younger. Last year we had more men than women in search for the first time probably in 25 years. And I really think that was about experience. Around race or ethnicity, this has been consistent. Around 10%, 9 to 12% have identified as Indigenous, Black, people of color. There is no majority within Unitarian Universalism. We get to about 40% of people who identify as multiracial, but people with various particular identities within that group. We got a new ministry search system about 5 years ago. In the old system, people had drop-down menus for what identity do you have. So on sexual orientation, where it was gay, lesbian, bi, heterosexual, 10 to 15% of the folks in ministry identified as gay, lesbian, bisexual. When we went to a system where now people write their word in, and people could use words like queer, pansexual, whatever word they wanted, it jumped to 35% of the ministers identifying as gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, pansexual. By the way, if someone identifies as queer, you're free to ask them what it means, because there is not a common definition. It differs from person to person. And I think that number is going to continue to go up. About 10% of our ministers were willing to be open about having a disability. Behind the scenes, I could see it was more like 25%. The most common disability that people list or condition, depression and anxiety. And I literally think that's only because we're more willing to talk about it than we were. I think there are a whole lot of people who never even got diagnosed or willing to be diagnosed or talked about it until it became more common to talk about. People in search ranging from ages to 23 to 70. The oldest person we've ever had in the settled search process in my time was 81. Didn't get a job. There's a reason now we have a question in the ministerial record sheet where they have to fill out, how long do you hope your next ministry lasts? Because for a while, anyone over 57 felt like they weren't going to get a settled position. We still think the national average for a ministry is about 7 years, but very few ministries last 7 years. They're either shorter or longer. So 7 becomes the average, but not predictable in terms of that. Let's go to your question.
Just a comment. Ingrid asked about the sort of people just coming out of the seminary, and that apparently was an issue when Stephen Epperson was applying, because he just came out of his out of the seminary. But what was important apparently to the search committee at that time was previous life experience, so that it's sort of, there's always the backstory.
There's always more to the story. I mean, the other thing that's really hard to know, that the search committee will get information from me when they've selected pre-candidates. But it's like, have they worked in a similar setting of any kind? You know, is this going to feel reasonable or normal? Or are they going to feel like, I mean, in some cases you maybe feel like you're taking a bigger risk for someone who's only ever been with a 100-member congregation, who may have 20 years of ministerial experience, as opposed to someone who's brand new, who's worked in a larger congregational setting, who might have lived in an urban area, who might have lived in Canada. All of these things become factors in who we are. Any other quick questions about stats? The other thing, I truly think all of religion and all of the world is in flux. I have actually been very fond of saying the entire world needs interim ministry at the moment, because we're all trying to figure out what is next. We're all in transition. Congregations have been very worried that they have to have this figured out by the time you get your next settled minister. That's not going to happen, and that's okay. It's better to be able to say, you know, we're still figuring this out. Can you be there and be a part of helping us figure it out, than to try and rush to a particular answer, because it's just not going to be the same. It is 11:47. My Fitbit still hasn't reset to Pacific time, so I just had to do the math. So let us come back at 2 minutes past the top of the hour. Take 15 minutes, use the restroom, stretch your legs, and then we'll come back. All right. One thing I wanted to say that a couple of you talked about the accessibility of getting up here. What I will tell you, we have no minister in a wheelchair full-time serving a congregation. We do have ministers who need strong railings in order to get upstairs and help. So if there's a way that they can hold on, they can move up the steps. We do have some ministers who use scooters. We don't, by the way, have any minister who's completely blind serving a congregation. We have several with significant vision impairment. I only know of one minister who is completely deaf, who is doing a ministry to the deaf community of California. She was a classmate of mine at seminary. And I know of lots of ministers with some degree of hearing loss. In fact, given the average age of Unitarian Universalists, it's probably the most common disability within Unitarian Universalism. That's just a reality that I hear again and again and again. And it's interesting because it will also be, as we talk about in a minute, one of the case studies for consideration. Because what has been interesting, and I'll go ahead and just talk about it while we're regathering, I'm going to give you case studies of things that have actually happened as a part of the UUA search process. And what I'm going to ask you all to do in smaller groups, and I have copies of them, is to talk about them together in the group to figure out what would you do or what are your thoughts if they were to happen here. For those of you who are online and watching, I want you to just think about the various case studies. You don't have to remember all of them. I'm going to give you 3 to specifically come back and we'll reflect on toward the end. But they're all things that have happened at least once in a UU congregation in the United States and Canada over time, and are real. And the first set are around race and ethnicity. And I'll get to the one I was just alluding to in a second. The first one is a case study that I already talked to you about. A third of the congregation is thrilled the congregation is called a minister of color, because now we're going to work on issues of race and racism. A third of the congregation is going, see, we're not racist. We have a minister of color serving us. A third petrified that this is all the minister is going to talk about. If your candidate were a minister of color, knowing that this might well be a scenario that would happen, what could you all do to sort of make this not the recurring story that every minister of color has told me? What could be your role in this? The second one applies directly to what we were just talking about. We've had ministers, not all people of color, but often, who've had accents, being immigrants from other countries. And congregations have been concerned about calling someone with a strong accent because they have so many people in the congregation with some degree of hearing loss. If you had a candidate who you thought was really good and yet they had a strong accent, how might that affect your choice? Next candidate. This happened with a minister who identified as Latino, and they were the candidate for a congregation. And they were trying to figure out during the candidating week, well, what neighborhood should I live in? And they're talking about a couple of neighborhoods, and someone who's listening to the minister said, well, what about this neighborhood? Wouldn't you rather live closer to your people? If you overheard that, what would your response be? Next case study. We really shouldn't be, someone says we shouldn't really look at a minister of color. They won't fit in or stay long. Our congregation is so very white. It would be unfair to the minister. If someone said that, how would you respond? Next case study. And not all of these may necessarily apply to you, but I want you to hear them just so you understand sort of what's going on a continental level. Congregation that either has a staff or another minister of color on staff. Someone says, well, we don't need to look at a minister of color because we already have that on the staff. If someone said something like that, what would your response be? We had a congregation that had a minister of color serving them. The congregation loved the minister, but what the congregation comes to learn is that one of the reasons the minister left is because of the almost daily microaggressions that one or two people said to the minister. The minister decided they just couldn't put up with anymore. And what the minister ultimately said was, the reason I couldn't put up with it, it's not that so-and-so said things to me. It's because I heard people in the congregation say things to me like, when I would bring this up, well, that's just Virgil. We ignore him. You should too. Oh, did you talk to them directly? It's not my problem. I'm sorry that happened to you. And then the person walked away. Well, this is what we pay you for. Virgil needs to learn from you to not be so racist. If something similar were to happen here, how would you deal with that? If you had a minister who said, you know, I'm just being worn down by someone who just simply is saying things that are hurtful, what would your response be? We're definitely coming back and talking about the next one. All-time favorite case study. Because it is unbelievable. An indigenous minister. Meeting the congregation during the candidating week in and there is an irony here, the Social Justice Committee of the congregation. They're sitting around in a circle, introducing themselves. They get to the last person in the circle who looks at the minister, smiles, and goes, how? Everyone turns and looks at the minister. If you were in that circle, what would you do? I'll tell you what happened in the congregation, and it's not what you think. The next case studies are around disability, mental health, health concerns, variations of the human condition. We're going to talk about this one too when we come back, because this may be particularly applicable here on some level, having lived here, where in December it doesn't get light until 8 and it's dark by 4. A minister on medication for depression keeps the information from the search committee. A minister is discovered by one search committee member taking it during the candidating week. The minister is worried about discussing this so early. Will the congregation be able to see me as anything other than a depressed person? The minister asked the person who saw them taking the medication not to tell anyone. How would you respond if someone asked you that question? By the way, we've also had this where someone has been outed for taking medication or having some sort of invisible disability by references. And what does a search committee do with that? That's been kind of interesting. A minister uses a scooter, this is the next case study, to travel long distances, but can get around without it for short distances. But someone says upon seeing this minister, well, this will be too difficult for the minister because our building, or in your case, pulpit, isn't accessible. The minister will make this their only issue. It'll cost too much to make it accessible. We can't afford that. Will the person have the stamina, be able to do the job? We just shouldn't be dealing with this right now. If you heard any of that, how would you respond? Next case study. A newly settled minister begins working with a congregation. Upon learning the new minister has a learning disability, someone in the congregation asks the search committee, well, is this person really smart enough to be our minister? Will the sermons be intellectual enough, especially after the first couple of sermons were so personal? How would you respond to that comment? Next case study, someone ministers are identified as being bipolar. In checking references, a search committee learns the minister lives with being bipolar. In talking it over with the rest of the search committee says, well, are we going to just have to take care of a minister? Aren't they likely to be erratic? Another search committee member says, we'll just have to remind them to take their medication. I'd be happy to do that. Getting back to the taking care of the minister. Another person says, no one who is bipolar should be a minister. How would you respond to any of those comments? Next case study. This is the one we talked about someone who's neurodivergent. A minister who identifies as being neurodivergent says they're less likely to look at someone. And after being interviewed, the search committee says, I don't think the minister is a good fit for us. They never looked at the screen once. I felt no connection. How would you deal if you heard someone say that? Next case study is around gender and gender identity. Our search committee is looking and advocating for a minister who seems to be great for the congregation, but someone else notices that the minister identifies as transgender, though they wouldn't have known that by anything they looked at. There are several strong voices on the committee who says, while the minister may be qualified, our congregation simply isn't ready for a transgender minister. One person says, there are enough people in the congregation who really don't understand what this means, and our community is too conservative and not ready for this, for us to be so open about this. How would you respond to any piece of that? Next case study is about pronouns. A minister has introduced themselves as gender non-binary. They say they don't use he or she to describe themselves. Someone says, well, we should just put pronouns on all of our name tags. But someone else says, I think this is going to upset some of our people. Some people, I think, constantly get pronouns wrong, and I think they do it on purpose. How would you deal with that potential conflict? A minister who identifies as gender non-binary is asked, but what gender were you really born? Or, when are you going to transition? If you heard either of those questions, someone saying, what would your response be? A woman is asked minister is asked by the congregant, we're hoping you'll be less angry than our last woman minister. She kept getting mad at the men and they stopped coming to church. Someone else says, well, we want you to do some intellectual sermons for us. We really like that. If you ever heard any of those comments, how would you respond? Next case study, a minister of Indian, South Asian descent is a candidate for a congregation. There are women who've expressed concern and wonder if he will be sexist to women. They cite people they have known in movies they have seen where they have noticed sexism in Indian males. One woman says she'd like to talk about this, but is afraid to talk about it directly. She wonders if there's a good way to ask. Every single Indian male in our denomination who is a minister has had to deal with this case study. Every single one. Next case study. Gender and age. A female candidate is asked, or is told, you're very wise for someone as so young. I don't think you'll be able to help an old person like me. Your sermon could have been more intellectual. Will you leave us to have kids? If you heard someone saying that to a younger female minister, how would you respond? Next case study is about sexual orientation. Minister uses the word queer to describe themselves. There are some members who say that they're offended by the word, were told never to use the word, and have indicated they'll vote against the minister because the minister uses that word. How would you respond to someone who said something like that? Next case study. A single bisexual minister is selected to be the candidate. During candidating week, the board chair is told that there are members who are afraid that the minister is going to sleep around with people in the congregation because they are single and bisexual. And what kind of role model will they be for children? How would you respond if you heard that? Someone asks, will we become a gay church if we call a gay minister? How would you respond to that? Another gay, lesbian, bi candidate is told, you know, we don't have homophobia in our congregation. You won't have to worry about that at all. There's some people focusing on racism and transphobia. Those are the real problems here. If you heard that, how would you respond? A couple of case studies about age, because age becomes a factor too. You all said this. I saw this in your data. Worried about someone who's older, that they won't stay that long. Shouldn't look at someone in their 60s. Shouldn't look at someone who's younger because they won't know enough to be a minister. How would you respond if you heard either of those things? Many younger ministers report that the congregations they are serving, this is becoming denomination-wide, by the way. This is another reason why younger ministers are choosing to go somewhere else. Many younger ministers report the congregation they served are expecting them to attract young people, yet with the additional expectations that the minister and the congregation will do things the way they have always done them. The ministers themselves have received complaints about not doing things in expected ways. These have included things like how they communicate, how they do worship, how they lead, how they do pastoral care, and how they spend their time as a minister. How would you deal with a generational difference here, particularly if one of these things appeared? A couple of things about class. During candidating week, a congregation learned the minister has come from what has been considered a working class job, road construction, hairstylist, janitor. And the minister is told by someone in the congregation, well, you don't need to talk about your former work. That would just be putting yourself down. If you heard someone saying that, how would you respond? Next case study. These are across identities. This is one that I probably should talk about because it came up a couple of times if you have time. Congregation says it's open to a minister of any identity as long as they act like the previous ministers. And in most cases, that's a straight, white, able-bodied male. What are the hidden expectations that might be for someone with a different identity, and how would you deal with that? Someone is concerned if they call someone of Middle Eastern or Middle Eastern identity, trans identity, anyone who's radical, that the congregation may become the target for violence. How would that happen? That's been particularly true in the States. I'm going to leave it there because that's more than enough. As you can see, this is not anything that we go away. You had a question, and I'll repeat the question. Oh, there's the microphone.
Just briefly, I came in a moment late there. Did you regard not an ethnicity, but how would we feel as Canadians having an American?
You can certainly talk about that as a case study.
Okay.
I didn't mention it, but you can certainly talk about it. I mean, I would save it for the last few minutes just so that you talk about the other things, but it's probably a really good conversation for you to have. What would it mean, and you could flesh that out?
Yeah.
What it would mean for someone
I didn't say Republican.
That reminds me to say something when I do the reporting out. But, what would it mean if you had someone coming from Quebec or Ontario who'd never lived in Western Canada? I mean, because having played the gay tennis tournaments in Quebec and Ontario and Vancouver, we're talking about, I've been to all 10 provinces now. We're not talking about a single culture that fits every place. Every place has its own differences. So you can talk about that. We are at 12:30. I want to give you about 15 minutes, which you're not going to have enough time to do all of them. So pick the ones that you think are most important and relevant to you. In particular, the how, in particular, depression. If you have time to talk about someone who, are we going to get another straight white male? How do we expect them to do that? That would be good. And the Canadian US one would be my top 4 to recommend. But if there's one you know you need to talk about or want to talk about, or one where you go, ooh, that scares me to talk about, that's probably one you need to talk about. So get into groups of about 4. Again, I have copies in case you want to refer back to them, and we'll regather in 15 minutes. I'll write them up in black so that you know which ones they are. So, yeah, right there. Never enough time. All right. I want to debrief the case studies in a second, but I want to give you a quick snapshot of UUism before, last year, and you all.
I have a question from Mary Lane. During our last search, there were 0 Canadians applying. Maybe the speaker could tell us if there are any that he knows are interested this time.
I might have talked to someone. In 1996, when we had people fill out the concerns and benefits, this was what we said as a denomination. Our number 1 concern around calling a minister of color was that they would be a single-issue minister. This is all they would talk about. The number 2 concern, they wouldn't be smart enough to be our UU minister. The number 3 concern, they'll be too Christian in their theology to be our minister. Number 4 concern, we won't be able to understand them. Number 5, we'll lose members. Last year, number 1 concern, we have more prejudice here than we think we do. That showed up about 7 or 8 years ago and moved up to number 1 about 4 years ago. Number 2 concern, our congregation is very white. Does the minister know what they're getting themselves into? Number 3 concern, our community is very white. Does the minister know what they're getting themselves into? Number 4 concern, there'll be a single-issue minister. Number 5, we won't be able to understand them. Here's what you all said of the 17 people who filled it out. Number 1 concern, we have more prejudice here than we think we do. More prejudice here than we think we do. Number 2 concern, this was a tide. 1 will commit microaggressions, the little things. The first one was the prejudice was mentioned 6 times, mentioned 5 times. Will commit microaggressions against the minister. Also concern over the 8th principle and how all of that unfolded, and would that bode poorly for a new minister. Those were both mentioned 5 times. Mentioned 3 times, we have more privilege here than we think we do. And then things only mentioned once. We'd only pick a minister of color to say we picked a minister of color, not because they're the best minister for us. Our congregation is very white. Would we be able to understand them, particularly with hearing impaired people in the congregation? Will we be able to see them as more than a single story? I've heard preferences that we find someone like those we've had before, a professorial type, and could this person be that? The benefits, which you all mentioned, which are kind of interesting. 7 people said, we'll grow, we'll become more diverse. You'll become more diverse by 1. Maybe 2. Their spouses also. It really takes both minister and congregation really working together for this to happen. It doesn't just happen when the minister shows up. People will visit. The question is, will they stay? Second concern, we'll learn something only if the minister feels comfortable enough to talking about themselves. We'll live our values, be good for the Indigenous black people of color here in the congregation. Vancouver is mostly Indigenous black people of color, so that would be good. They'd be a role model, help us live into our eighth principle. Around disability and health. Number one concern in 1996, stamina, won't be able to do the job. Number two concern, our building isn't accessible, it costs too much to make it accessible. Number three, will we have to take care of our minister? Number four, will we be able to understand them? Number five, don't want a minister who's alcoholic or will fall off the wagon. 2022, number one concern, stamina, won't be able to do the job. Number two concern, our building isn't accessible, costs too much to make it accessible. Number three concern, will we have to take care of our minister? Number four concern, will we be able to understand them? The only difference in 26 years is number five. And now, instead of worried about an alcoholic, someone with any kind of emotional disorder. It was interesting, about 2005, it switched from alcoholism to depression. And then about 5 years ago, it switched to any kind of emotional disorder. Bipolar, people would read a list. Here's what you all said. Number one concern, stamina, will they be able to do the job? Number two concern, concerned about someone with any kind of emotional disorder. Number three, campus, particularly the pulpit, not being accessible. Both of those actually tied for number two. Fourth one, will we be able to understand them? And then after that, we have more prejudice than we think. I'm slowly beginning to hear that pop up, but even then, I don't hear it in half the congregations yet about all of this. And then want to make sure we have someone who doesn't have a cognitive disability, someone who's smart enough. Just a reminder, every U minister goes through the same process. They have to have a master's degree from a seminary. They have to go before the fellowship committee. They have to do an internship with a congregation. They have to do a hospital chaplaincy. They're pretty even standards. One person concerned, we might not accommodate a minister's disabilities. We might have to take care of the minister also came up. We still see this as a pity issue in far too many places. We're slowly beginning to see it as a justice issue. And I'm just amazed at how slow we've been. You all are better than the United States, and I still think it's an issue everywhere. Positives, we'll learn something only if the minister was willing to talk about their disability. Second, we live our values, we'd find a way to make this accessible. And then one person each said they'd be a role model, they'd represent, they'd be dismantling oppression by example. Around gender, this one we only have stats for last year because we included transgender as with sexual orientation for years. Last year we put gender out. We got some interesting results. Number one concern, transgender. Not ready for it, don't know what it really means. Number two, pronouns are going to be a problem. Number three, our community is conservative. Number four, going back to just female, sexism is real. Number five, we don't want another straight white male. Here's what you all said. Number one concern around gender, sexism is real. Number two concern, transgender. Only mentioned once, pronouns, someone who's too far on one end. I interpret that, where I hear it in U.S. congregations, as flamboyant. Flamboyantly trans, really pushing. We have more prejudice than we think. We've had two single white men, so having something else will be harder than we think. Someone said we need more men in the congregation. All very interesting. The benefits, we'll learn from them. They'll be a good role model. Live values will grow, will be good for the straight white males in the congregation if we get someone who isn't a straight white male. That very muted, though, on the benefits. Sexual orientation, number one concern, 1996, will become a gay church. It's like, yeah, you should be so lucky. Number two concern, will children be safe around the minister? Number three concern, there'll be a single issue minister. Number four, we live in a conservative area. Even the people in San Francisco in 1996 tried to tell me they were in a conservative part of San Francisco. Number five, will they be able to do pastoral care with straight people? Tied with, will they be promiscuous? In the denomination, most of the promiscuity has been with the straight white men in our denomination. Last year, number one concern, single issue. That's all they'll talk about. Number two, we have more prejudice than we think. Number three still comes up. Will we become a gay church? Number four, we're in a conservative area. Number five, not sure I'm comfortable with someone who's bisexual. Now, this is way more muted than it was 26 years ago. It's clearly where we've done most of our work, and yet it still comes up and still gets mentioned. What you all said, totally muted here. Only 3 responses. Homophobia still exists. We have more prejudice than we think. We forget about bisexuality. Bi people can be erased here. That was it. I think that's a sign of the work you've done and the community that you're a part of. The benefits, we'll learn something, there'll be a role model, we'll live our values. It shows the good work that we've done. Other things that came up that you all said. No, the only thing that was mentioned more than once, which is why I wanted you to talk about the case study, we're going to expect someone to be a straight white male like we've had before. That was mentioned 3 times. Other things that were mentioned, worried about calling someone with a large family because it'll be expensive, too expensive. Worried about someone who's polyamorous, someone who has more than one partner. Worried about someone who's obese. That's usually the number one concern in the other concerns. And I always note that because only twice has anyone ever said they've been worried about having someone who's anorexic. Which I think says something about our larger society in general. Someone concerned about a working class background, someone concerned about someone unkempt, someone concerned about, we seem to have developed a right way to think about things here, someone concerned about neurodiversity, someone concerned about where they might be on the introvert-extrovert spectrum, someone concerned about someone too old. Someone said they knew someone whose spouse was blue-collar and stopped coming because they felt it was just too intellectual and they weren't welcome here. That's it. You look like a Canadian congregation in a liberal part of the world that has done a fair amount of work but still has work to do. And that I think is just real. Let me talk about the case studies. This one in particular. 2 things that are fascinating to me about that particular case study. We'd done the case study in a congregation, I'll just say without identifying, north of the 49th parallel, where the people in the congregation got very insistent that the minister should disclose the fact that they live with depression to everyone and should talk about what medication they were on. A member of the search committee, who was a doctor, stood up and went, fine. I will ask that. As a doctor, I'll ask them what medication they're on. As long as now each and every one of you tell me what medication you're on. Room went dead silent. And he went on, you do not ask your boss what medication they're on. You don't ask your coworkers what medication they're on. You don't ask your children's teacher what medication they're on. You don't ask your doctor what medication you're on. And I can tell you as a doctor, we have more access to medication than anyone. Why are you creating this double standard for your minister that you have for no one else? And you could just sort of see the learning happen in that moment for any number of folks. What they decided in this congregation was that the minister would talk about living with depression, but that the search committee would also help present him as being more than a single story. And they would work specifically Because truly, this is a no-win scenario. No one should be asked to keep secrets. No one should be forced to reveal their medication. You might find yourself in a no-win scenario. That might be real. But finding ways in which people can be seen more than a single story, really important. Very quick question or comment.
The case study wasn't so much about depression and medication. It was about the candidate asking someone to keep it a secret, as if you know. And
It's really about all of it. That's a huge part of the case study, though. I mean,
yeah, because then I wouldn't. If I found out about that, I would not trust this person in some ways.
well, you know, it's interesting because in the 80s, there were people who knew their minister was gay or lesbian and other people who didn't. That created its own set of problems. Who can I talk to about this? Who knows about that? The issue of secret keeping really matters. But the other real issue is if you're on medication, that should be your own decision as opposed to some sort of public. And I was intrigued by the congregation that thought everyone should know. How? Here's what the minister told me. The minister said, when everyone turned and looked at me, I knew I could say absolutely nothing. I had no idea who in that room would support me and who did not. They still haven't talked about it 5 years later. But the minister did say to me, if one person had said, were you making a joke? I was taught never to say something like that. Can you tell me what you meant by that? The curiosity question, getting more information. Then the minister said they would have felt comfortable entering into the conversation. The easiest way to keep any oppression in place is through silence. If you talk about it, even if you say the wrong thing, learning is likely to happen. The problem in a UU culture, we often would rather say nothing than say the wrong thing, because often there is an effort to show that we are very smart people. Sometimes any number of congregations, it's a race to show that I'm the smartest person in the room. So often silence wins because we're afraid of saying the wrong thing and things stay in place.
So the bystander syndrome is big. And if you are witness to something that is offensive as a bystander, it's important for you, if you feel safe, because there are safety concerns in some instances, you must speak up or do something. And silence is the killer.
Silence will keep things exactly as they are and actually make things worse.
I thought Kirsten gave a very good answer in our group. I thought Kirsten might want to.
If you feel comfortable, feel free.
Thank you, yeah. In a lot of the study and the work that I've done over the past few years, learning about how to stay in conversation, as bystanders in a congregation, we're always in relationship. So leaning into connection with each other, as opposed to shutting somebody out. So saying something, definitely, but like you had mentioned, the curiosity, the what did you mean by that? Or I'm feeling uncomfortable, can we take a pause? But
All
continuing to stay in relationship with each other, which is different than bystanding among strangers.
Right. It's so true. I mean, there's a button we give to that I give to every new interim minister. It reads, more curiosity, less judgment. Because I literally think what you said was exactly right. I mean, it's like, I wouldn't think to say that, but let me ask you why you did, because who knows what I might learn as a result, and who knows what you didn't know. And the reality is, in our congregations, where in theory we want more people to come, we're going to have people who come from a lot of different settings who may not know all the ins and outs of what our culture is. And so that's a part of the educational process. I think that's so true. Let me talk about what next, because we're a little bit over time, and I know some of you really needed to leave at 1. Thank you for coming out today. Good to be with you all. Looking forward to being with you all tomorrow as well. I will just reiterate what I just said. Don't let the conversation stop here. Find a way to keep talking. My challenge to you is to talk to one person who wasn't here today who's a member of the congregation, at least one, and figure out a way to continue the conversation. Whether it's to take the case studies and talk about that. Some congregations have used the case studies for small group ministry discussions. You're free to do any of that. Just keep talking to each other, because I think that is where the growth and the hope lies. And can we keep having these conversations? Because we don't just magically do it. The last thing I want to say that you made me think of. There used to be a lore within ministers. It takes 17 people in a congregation to end a ministry. It takes one person to end a ministry and 16 people acquiescing. We've got to be a place where we can openly talk with each other, even if we disagree, and listen with that curiosity. That's really what's going to matter. So keep having the conversations. Thank you for being here. Thanks to the search committee. Thank you, Christian, for all of the tech help. Thanks to you online who've been watching on YouTube. And you have a final.
Yes. Thank you, Keith, for coming here to Vancouver again. Welcome back. We really appreciate your input into this process of finding a new minister that fits our congregation. And I hope that you will all be actively involved, as Keith said. Keep talking about it with other people that you know who are members of our congregation, because that's important. When we finish the process and we bring someone that we present to you to vote on to be our next minister, we hope that you will all have been engaged in the process. And this is part of the process. And so thank you, and we look forward to you being in the pulpit tomorrow.
Looking forward to it.
All right, good.
Thank you all.